What if prison wasn't the worst thing that could happen to Diddy? What if the real punishment started after the bars closed behind him? A prison doctor is now exposing the terrifying reality of what's happening inside. A reality that could cost Diddy his life. From coerced relationships to life-threatening infections, the details will leave you questioning everything. Do you think he deserves this? Let me know in the comments. And before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, because the truth is just getting started. I work in the medical wing of one of the most notorious prisons in the country. And what I'm about to tell you, I've witnessed it firsthand. This isn't a story from the news, and it's not just prison gossip. This is what I saw with my own eyes. When Diddy was first brought in, the entire prison felt it. You could hear it in the hushed voices in the halls, see it in the way inmates leaned in closer to each other, exchanging glances. A man like him, famous, powerful, untouchable on the outside, was now just another prisoner. But here, his fame wasn't an advantage. It was a death sentence. I've been in this system long enough to know how it works. A name like his doesn't just get ignored, it gets haunted. And sure enough, within days the pressure started. Here, the most dangerous men don't just survive, they rule. They run this place like warlords, controlling everything from food to protection, from contraband to life itself. Their word is law, and refusing them, that's a risk most men aren't willing to take. At first, Diddy tried to stay in the shadows. He kept to himself, moved cautiously, avoided eye contact. He must have thought that if he kept his head down, the wolves would pass him by. But no one hides in prison for long. Especially not someone like him. The whispers started almost immediately. Prisoners watching him, waiting. Some saw him as a golden ticket, a man with resources they could exploit. Others saw him as a trophy, a chance to prove their dominance. And then there were the ones who wanted something worse. It wasn't long before I started hearing things, his name being passed around in quiet conversations. Low offers being made. Some men approached him directly, offering him an exchange protection for something in return. The kind of protection that doesn't come for free. I've seen it before. Some prisoners accept it willingly. They believe there's no other way to survive. Others, they refuse, thinking they can hold out. But here, refusing doesn't mean walking away. It means running out of time. And did he? He was running out fast. There was a day when he walked into my ward, silent, guarded, different. His injuries weren't severe. Scrapes, bruises, nothing deep enough to be life-threatening. But it wasn't the wounds that caught my attention. It was his face. I've seen that look before. A hollow stare, lips pressed tight, shoulders tense, like he's holding in something too heavy to carry. Prisoners come in here all the time with stories they don't want to tell, injuries they claim were accidents. But I know better. And did he? He wasn't talking. When I asked what had happened, he gave me a vague response. Just a misunderstanding. His voice was low, detached, the words slipping out like they didn't belong to him. I didn't push because I didn't have to. I already knew. I've treated men who've been forced into things they can't even put into words. Their bodies heal, but their eyes never do. And that day when I looked at Diddy, I realized he had joined them. He left my ward a different man than the one who had walked in, darker, quieter. Something inside him had been taken, and he knew there was no getting it back. Then, a few weeks later, the first signs of infection appeared. We run routine tests here. It's part of the system. But when I saw his results, I knew something was wrong. I can't confirm anything officially, but as a doctor, you learn to see the patterns. And this was a pattern I had seen before. In prison, illness spreads in ways people don't like to talk about. When coercion is involved, when violence is used as currency, when survival forces men into impossible choices, disease is never far behind. And the worst part? By then, he had already stopped fighting. I watched him withdraw further into himself, showing up less and less for treatment, ignoring the signs as if he already knew what was coming. People on the outside think punishment ends at a prison sentence, but inside these walls, the real punishment is what happens after. People like to believe prisons are controlled environments, places where everything is monitored, regulated, locked away. But the truth is much darker. Drugs don't just exist behind bars, they thrive. I've lost count of the number of prisoners I've treated for overdoses, for infections caused by shared needles, dirty syringes, makeshift drug use. The system pretends to crack down on it. But the truth is, trafficking here is more sophisticated than most people realize. And did he? When he arrived, he was already breaking. You could see it in the way he moved, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he flinched at sounds that shouldn't have scared him. The rumors started early. He was using it. At first he denied it. They all do. They say they'd never touch the stuff, that they're stronger than that. But prison doesn't care how strong you used to be. Then the marks started to show. Thin red lines along his arms, bruises in places that didn't match his explanations. I asked him about them once. He just shook his head, didn't say a word, but his body was already telling me everything I needed to know. Another day, another wound. But this time it was different. He walked into my infirmary, his arms swollen, red with inflammation, burning with infection. I asked him what had happened. And he barely looked at me, just shook his head and muttered something about a fight. I've heard that excuse many times. I knew it wasn't true. His body was telling a different story. The swelling, the way his skin was starting to tighten. It wasn't from a punch or a scrape. It was the kind of infection that comes from dirty needles, from syringes passed between desperate hands, from men who have long stopped caring about the consequences. And yet I didn't push him for the truth, because I already knew it. Here, addiction isn't just about getting high, it's about escape. Some men take drugs to forget where they are, others to stop feeling anything at all. Diddy wasn't the first to walk in with an infection like this, and he wouldn't be the last. The syringes in here, they're used over and over, passed around without sterilization, without care. It's a game of Russian roulette where the bullet doesn't lead. It's disease, HIV, hepatitis, infections that start slow but end in suffering. And yet, when I looked at him, I saw something worse than the infection. I saw resignation. There was no fear in his eyes, no urgency, just indifference. He knew what was happening to his body, and it was as if he had already accepted the outcome. I can't say for sure whether this was a deliberate act, a slow kind of self-sabotage, but I've been in this place long enough to recognize a man who stopped fighting and Diddy had stopped. Addiction isn't the only poison in this place. Violence is just as common, just as deadly. Here you don't need a reason to get attacked. Sometimes looking at the wrong person at the wrong time is enough. I've treated stab wounds over card games, broken bones over stolen food, men beaten half to death over nothing but ego. Diddy became a target the moment he stepped inside these walls. Fame isn't an asset here, it's an invitation for men to prove themselves. One day he showed up with deep cuts across his face, arms covered in slashes that weren't meant to kill, just to send a message. He told me he was attacked in the cafeteria. Didn't give details. Didn't need to. I could tell by the injuries. They weren't random, they were calculated. And this is where things get dangerous. Most people don't realize how easy it is to die in a place like this. Not from the fight itself, but from what comes after. Blood gets everywhere in a brawl, on fists, on shanks, on the floor where men collapse. And in a prison like this, where HIV and hepatitis lurk in the shadows, one wrong cut can be a death sentence. I've treated prisoners who never even realized they had been infected until months later. One fight, one scratch, one moment of contact with the wrong person's blood, and their fate is sealed. Diddy was no different. I don't know if he understood the risks if in that moment. While he was defending himself, he thought about the contaminated blade cutting into his skin, the blood smeared on his knuckles, the microscopic danger seeping into every open wound. But what I do know is this. His injuries weren't just physical. He was breaking, not just in body, but in mind. In the beginning, Diddy avoided medical treatment like a man who didn't want confirmation of what he already knew. That's another thing I've learned in this place. When prisoners suspect something is wrong, most of them would rather not know. They ignore the signs, pretend they're fine until it's too late. And Diddy was no exception. At first I thought it was fear, but the more I watched him, the more I realized it wasn't fear at all. It was surrender. Every fight, every injury, every time he refused help. It wasn't just survival. It was self-destruction. Men don't just fight battles against each other in prison, they fight battles against themselves. And I could see it in him. The slow unraveling, the loss of will, the acceptance that this place had already won. Diddy was a man who had once had everything. Money, power, fame. But when those things were stripped away, all that was left was the raw, unfiltered truth. And in here, the truth is brutal. As a doctor, You learn to recognize when someone is hurting themselves. Self-injurers, especially in an environment like this, often do it for two reasons: to feel something in the midst of emotional emptiness, or to hasten what they see as an inevitable ending. In his case, there were times when I would watch him and think he's not just accepting what's happening, he's giving himself over to it. Reports from other prisoners were also worrying. I heard he was deliberately isolating himself, refusing offers of protection, even food. On some days he avoided social interactions, and that's a clear sign someone is entering a downward spiral. When you see someone move away from the little that keeps them connected to reality, you know they are dealing with something serious. Then there was the way he handled his health. He started rejecting basic treatments, ignoring infections, letting problems fester, things that could have been taken care of easily. But that's the thing. When people lose hope, they stop taking care of themselves. Deep down, they've already decided it's not worth it anymore. The hardest thing to watch as a doctor is the mental deterioration of someone who on the outside was seen as unshakable. Diddy was not the man the world knew. He was a broken reflection, someone who seemed to be using prison as a stage to express his pain in destructive ways. What he did to himself, it was cry for help. But in here, cries like that often go unheard. In the end, acts of self-destruction like his are a way of giving up. And for someone with so much to lose, this surrender is both a tragedy and a reminder. A reminder of how devastating prison can be to the mind and spirit. One of the cruelest things about prison is the way inmates establish their hierarchies. There are men here who control everything, from food distribution to drug trafficking to deciding who is allowed in certain areas. For someone like Diddy, famous and financially well-off, he quickly became a target. From the first few days, it was clear he was being watched. Influential men in prison always try to recruit or exploit people like him. Sometimes it's for money, other times it's simply to demonstrate power. And for many, refusing these offers, that's not an option. It doesn't take long for these dynamics to force someone into things they never imagined. I heard the reports he was invited to be part of certain groups. But these groups, they don't just form alliances for protection, they demand loyalty. And loyalty comes with a price. I've seen it before. New members forced into degrading acts made to prove their worth, their commitment. With Diddy, it was clear he was under the control of one of these groups. Many prisoners end up being sexually exploited or forced into humiliating acts as a form of submission. It's about power, control, ownership, and in here, those who own you decide your fate. This isn't just physical, it's psychological. They break you down, make you dependent, keep you afraid. And once you're in, there's no way out. I remember a quick conversation we had while he was waiting to be seen. It was brief, just a passing moment, but the words have stayed with me ever since. In here, you learn that power is an illusion, he said. A simple statement, but heavy with meaning. He knew. He understood exactly what was happening to him, understood the way he was being used, the way he was being drained of everything that once made him untouchable. And yet there was no fight in his voice. It was as if he had already accepted it, as if he believed there was no other choice. That's the part that lingers in my mind, the realization that he wasn't just physically vulnerable, but mentally defeated. I've seen this cycle before. Once a man falls into it, it's nearly impossible to climb back out. The things you do to survive, the things you endure, they don't just disappear when the prison lights go out. They stay with you, they carve themselves into you, and eventually they become a part of you. Because survival in here isn't always about strength. It's about connections. It's about knowing the right people, belonging to the right groups, making the right sacrifices at the right time. For someone like Diddy, things were different. He wasn't just another prisoner. He was a public figure, a man with influence, a man with a name that carried weight beyond these walls. But influence and fame mean nothing when you have no one to protect you. From the beginning, he was at a disadvantage. Everyone knew it. Without alliances, without people to stand behind him, he became an easy target. And in a place like this, power isn't something you hold, it's something you owe favors. That's the currency in here. That's how things work. Protection isn't given for free. It has a price. And when money isn't enough, when there are no more payments left to make, that price becomes something else entirely. There were rumors. Persistent ones. Whispers that he had made deals with influential groups, that he had started offering things in exchange for security. Deals that weren't made out of real choice, but out of necessity. It's always the same pattern. I've seen it too many times to count. Men with financial resources are forced to pay just to keep breathing.